Right, you good? Now, so you got Kara's phone. Okay. Kara's phone. My phone.
Yeah. All right. Hello, Tandem members. I'd like to welcome you to this International Women's Day event. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we meet on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. I pay respect to elders in the various areas across our state where you're joining us from. And I'd also like to pay respect to people with lived experience as consumers and as carers in the audience today. And I welcome you all to this session. And I thank you for your ongoing commitment and efforts towards reform, and hope that you're eagerly and carefully reading the final report recommendations as we all are. And thank you for joining us today. We're really excited to be with you and to share thoughts with you, initial thoughts, big document and big process. So thank you for joining us today. We look forward to your questions as well in due course. I'd like to just take a moment to introduce panel members and also some prompt questions to make sure that you can all orient together about the kinds of things we're going to talk about today. And I also want to just let you know before we begin that we had intended to have an additional panel member, the lovely Maggie Toko from Vimiat. Maggie's not well today. She sends her apologies, but she may well join us online along with some of you a little bit later today. She'll just see how she's going. And so thoughts with you, Maggie, speedy recovery. So I'd like to introduce Professor Jayashri Kulkarni, and she's the director of Monash Alfred Psychiatry Research Centre, MAPRC. Many of you will know the excellent work of MAPRC. Professor Kulkarni is an internationally acknowledged leader in the field of reproductive hormones and their impact on mental health. And Professor Kulkarni became a Fellow of the Royal Australian-New Zealand College of Psychiatrists in 1989. She was awarded a PhD from Monash University in 1997 for her thesis, Women and Psychosis. And she was elected President of the International Association of Women's Mental Health in 2017. We welcome Jayashri to our panel today.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
It's lovely to have you here. And I'd like to welcome Anna Love, the Chief Mental Health Nurse, in the Office of the Chief Mental Health Nurse for our state. She's been in that role for over 5 years, and prior to that was the Director of Nursing in the Mental Health Program at St Vincent's, Melbourne Public, and that's where I know Anna from for many years, having the privilege of working alongside her and witnessing her strong commitment to strengths-based and recovery-oriented models of care and treatment. Welcome, Anna.
Thanks.
Welcome. And I'd also like to welcome Megan Phelan. Megan, who I'm just getting to know, the Executive Director of Strategy and Implementation at Mental Health Reform Victoria. She brings strong relationship management and skills in working with international and national stakeholders, including ministers, diplomats, senior academics, government and business leaders to achieve policy objectives. And we're really excited to have her also join us today in discussion.
Thanks, and good morning, everyone.
The questions that were shared with the panel members in advance of today that they'll each speak to you a little bit about, and then we'll have more of a conversation. What do the final recommendations mean to the mental health and wellbeing of Victorian women? What are the opportunities the recommendations offer women? Are there any limitations for women? And does this translate to all women, marginalised women, consumers of mental health services who identify as women, LGBTIQ women, and women supporting someone on a mental health recovery journey through the mental health system. So a range of possible questions to respond to. So who would like to start? Who would like to say a few words to bring people in? Questions, big prompts, big agenda for today, and a lot we're all still digesting with the report.
Well, I'll jump in.
Jump in. Thank you.
So first of all, as you said, this is a huge report with 65 recommendations has just come out last Tuesday. And it's really hard to get your head around the whole 5 volumes because there's so much detail in there, and there needs to be. So, you know, that's number one. It's going to be very hard to speak, having digested all of it. So I think that I'm speaking for myself. The second part of it is, though, I think mental health reform in Victoria has been long overdue, and we've been struggling with an archaic system that hasn't met the needs really of anyone. You know, hasn't met the needs of the consumers, hasn't met the needs of the carers, and hasn't met the needs of the clinicians working in the system either. So, you know, it's pretty much laid down there that the system needed to, I would think, be gutted and start again. And so this Commission's report with the 65 recommendations and the work of MERV, Mental Health Reform Victoria, is really, really critical. And I think the detail is exactly what was needed. So, you know, our personal congratulations to all the people involved, and a lot of the people here, I'm sure, who went and spoke to the commissioners and so on. So having said that, what we're all holding our breath about now is here is this big tome of work with a lot of detail. Will that get translated into actual reform, as we all groups want to see it happen? And I think that's the question that everyone's asking at the moment, like, where's the money coming from? And will it be adequate enough to be able to see things happen in the way that the recommendations say, but also as all the people have been saying, you know, we want. So if I can kick off on one point, which is my particular soapbox, so drag me off it and I'll go on and on and on about it. But I've been banging the drum about safety for women in our inpatient units for decades. Now, it seems bleeding obvious, right, that if a woman comes in to hospital for care and treatment of whatever it is, depression, whatever it is, it would be expected that she would be safe, she would receive the care and go home in better shape than when she came in. Obvious. Unfortunately, the way our inpatient units in the public sector and the private sector have been structured, it's always been with men and women together. And so what's happened over time is, as people have got sicker and sicker, because community treatment's been the mode to go to, then really the sickest only come into hospital, and the sick people are managed all together. And so we've seen woman after woman after woman experience verbal assault, sexual assault, physical assault. Now, when you speak to Joe Blow in the pub, Josephine or Joe Blow in the pub, they go, well, that's ridiculous. You know, of course you would have separate areas for women and separate areas for men. And again, with the gender fluidity, you can do that for the identification. So someone who identifies as woman could be safe and go into that area. Now, in the recommendations, so there's a whole section devoted to this, and you know, we bang the drum a lot about this, and we got a good hearing. And then the detail, this is taken up with quite a lot of detail. When you look at the recommendation, it's really watered down. Now, maybe that's just because recommendations have to be broad and understood by everybody, but I would hate to see all that work in the context and the detail get lost, because we need to not have rubbery, watery situations where the assaults can still go on. We need actual safety for our female and those who identify as women patients in the inpatient settings. And it's not that hard. It's about the architecture. Make it nice, make it safe, build walls where you need to, but it can be done. And I really hope it can be done. And the context gives me hope, but the recommendation makes me worried. So there's my soapbox to start with.
It's a good one. It's an important one. Would anyone else on the panel like to add thoughts about safety and inpatient settings?
Yeah, I mean, just to re-emphasise what you've already said, Jayashree, I think what the recommendations do for me is, at a very high level, it actually makes a statement. So it makes a statement about the more high-level strategic context, but what's in the detail of the report is actually where the information, but also the how to do is going to come from. That's where we all are focusing our reading, and certainly from my position, that's where I'm going. To actually to read the detail, to understand what the context is that we're being asked, and what's the change that we're actually being asked to make in this huge reform. And I think just to go back a step is to remember this is a 10-year plan. This, there are things that are not going to happen tomorrow, as much as we'd all dearly love them to happen tomorrow, but it's going to take us 10 years to get there. And I think we just also have to remember that, as much as we're all going to be passionate and really wanting things to change now, that it is a 10-year plan. But what the recommendations and the detail in the document actually call out is a redesign of all new inpatient facilities, that they actually have to be designed in a way that you actually do have separate bedrooms and bathrooms and communal areas, and that's a gender-based separation. Now, the one thing in the report, and I think Jisha and I were just talking about this earlier, is the fact that it talks about gender in the broadest way. So, it will talk about LGBTQI, it will talk about people that identify as women. So there is some detail there that needs to be worked through about even how a design works in that respect and how it can be flexible in that respect. But we do know it's possible. When we talk to our the parts of the department that do the building and the architecture, they've gone round the world and looked at different spaces, and it's possible. It's possible to have good design that's flexible enough to give safety for everyone. And that's what we want to see in Victoria. I think also, the chief psychiatrist guidelines as they stand have been called out that that's a minimum standard. What I would say is those are in review, and there are many people from Tandem and from VMIAC and across the sector who are being involved in the discussions around the new guidelines and how they're actually going to impact on the sector. So I think what it does call out is a change to models of care too. So the workforce, no person in the workforce comes into work actually expecting people to be harmed by the environment or by the care that they're giving. And unfortunately, due to design and other circumstances, people have been harmed. And we, from the chief psychiatrist's perspective, we look at sexual safety incidents across the state. And the fact that people are actually calling it out now is actually such a major step forward. We now know what's actually happening, more than we've ever done, about what's actually happening in inpatient units, about how people feel and how they feel safe or not safe in those environments. So that's actually giving us the evidence to be able to make the change, and actually to be able to work with the workforce too about what they need to do to assist in that change process of a different culture. I think the other thing that the report also calls out is governance, and the governance and calling out actually sexual safety and gender safety as part of the governance structure is actually critical, because it calls out the new Mental Health Commission, it calls out the Mental Health Improvement Unit in Safer Care Victoria, the chief psychiatrist, the division, all having a responsibility and oversight around gender safety. And I think that is such a huge shift, because it wasn't called out previously. We've been working in the chief psychiatrist's office and looking at sexual safety and gender safety as if it was a statutory function, and giving it the same credence. It's now being called out in this report that it should be, and through all the governance structures, that it should actually be something which we are paying due attention to,
at all levels. So I think that's a positive. So I think there are many positives about the future, but the future is going to take time, and it's going to take a lot of consultation and co-design, absolute co-design, which is being called out in the report. And that co-design with consumers and carers and clinicians to make sure that our services are safe in the future.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd just like to pick up on that point, Anna. So having come from a year in mental health reform Victoria, where we're implementing the interim report recommendations, what we've seen is the really critical kind of translation from that high level policy and design that the Royal Commission has given us, and how do we translate that into a more detailed design and delivery, something that can be operationalised. And that for us has been a really important dialogue with people with lived experience, including, through the leadership of Tandem and VIMIAC. And it's through that dialogue that we have developed models of care together with health services, with people with lived experience. So I can see why the Royal Commission, they've given us some really important policy directions. In some cases, they've been quite specific, but they have also said that this ongoing dialogue and collaboration needs to continue as we develop models of care. And I think that's really important from our work over the last year. That's where we've had some kind of gender focus developed through the more detailed design of programs. It's actually come from engagement with women's mental health and health peaks, and with Tandem, VIMIAC and others. So that's the really critical component. How do we continue that dialogue and build on the work that the reform has given us? The Royal Commission has given us. And I think there's one other really critical component in this report, and that is there are so many incredibly important aspects, but a really important one is the outcomes framework, which the Royal Commission has kind of placed front and centre, and that is, it's asking us collectively to define what is the vision, what does this good look like, and what are our indicators of success. And I think when we get to that is a kind of a co-designer or a collaborative design process, we are saying what is important, what are we going to define and measure ourselves against. And again, really good opportunity there to be able to focus in on some of the specific kind of gender elements that we might want to see brought out, and ensure that our focus is kept firmly on those areas as we deliver over what is going to be a very long kind of delivery process for the recommendations.
Interestingly, just to add to that, there is a tender for a 35-bed women's mental health unit,
yes,
and it's women only,
yes,
to be treated as inpatients. So that's out there at the moment. We haven't got results of that, but that's an interesting step into this area of thinking about women's mental health as a separate area that needs separate, to meet the needs, you need separate approaches and new approaches. And then to ensure the safety in that way is really, I think, the sort of thing that banging the drum for decades.
That's
and
right.
It's great to see that that's been out there.
That's a really good example. So that's comes from a recommendation in the interim report, Royal Commission's interim report. They didn't ask that we look specifically to women's mental health issues to deliver on the 35 kind of public-private beds, but it was through our engagement with peak bodies, with people with lived experience, that this emerged really as kind of a critical and unmet need. And so, what's emerged is a centre that specifically addresses women's mental health issues. And we are still in the middle of what is a competitive process, but I can say that we were really pleased with the response that we got to that expression of interest that went out to health services, public and private. And really excited, hopefully in the coming weeks, to be able to announce the outcome of that. But it will definitely be filling a gap. But a good reminder, the Royal Commission doesn't necessarily have to call out a gender focus, but we may end up delivering one following consultation.
I'm really excited about this particular unit as well.
Oh, we were cheering.
I've been engaged in some research with the lovely Ellie Fossey and the skilled Karen Dixon over some years, looking at the Women's Only Park and from the Photo Voice project and some other research with the women in that space. And the safety issue that wasn't the focus of the research, but it came through so strongly, just how much it means to women in that space to have that sense of safety. And I'm just very excited by the potential of this new announcement.
And it's interesting with flow on. So it's not just, for the carers who've got young sons or male relatives. It's interesting that once you do take a gender lens, you actually start to think about the issues that are important for different genders. And again, I've got to say, the gender fluid group, don't miss out, because it's about actually saying gender is important. Whether you want to define yourself as AB or some other is okay, because we understand that gender is a pillar of mental health. And so whatever your needs are, we need to think about them specifically. So I think the whole gender debate is really taking a big centre stage. And I'm personally like, yes, that's where we need to be with that. Trauma's the other one.
Yes.
As well, when we think about things that are big pillars for mental health and have been missed in the past. Now, again, this is another one of my soapboxes, so if I can. Trauma as a factor in the causing of mental illness has been overlooked and then unfortunately perpetuated when it's not noticed that there's a interpersonal violence going on at home, or that there is a past trauma and it gets kind of enacted in the emergency department by neglect or abuse in some way. So these sorts of issues, I think we're much more, as you said, Anna, we're much more comfortable talking about these issues. And particularly women have experienced a lot of emotional trauma, physical trauma, sexual trauma in their background, which then causes the mental illness 20, 30 years down the track still. And a particular bugbear of mine is the personality disorder label, borderline personality disorder. I strongly oppose that one, because I think what's missing in that is the understanding of trauma and why the individual is behaving in the way, and usually she is, because it's a maladaptive, but it's a response to trauma. And so if we look at it that way, we'll probably get better outcomes for this particularly big group who are, I think, very misunderstood. So again, there's work in the report which suggests that there'll be new approaches that suits this group much better. And again, we know that the carers are so critical in the coping and the management of this particularly big group. So working with the couple, working with the family is really critical here. And again, bringing that in, I think, is great, and is one of the recommendations.
Yeah, that's exciting.
So there you go, I've got two of my soapboxes.
And it is exciting that trauma has been called out, because it's been called out in the sense of establishment of a centre dedicated to trauma, which is important for consumers of the service and carers, but for the staff to be able to understand what trauma actually means and how to. We use the language of to work in a trauma-informed way, but we've never really defined what that means for the staff.
It just rolls off the tongue.
It rolls off the tongue. It's in every document, but we actually now need to start defining it and actually training people to work in a particular way. So the support that that this recommendation gives to everyone is actually really very significant, because, as you say, it's the pillars. Because I always go back. I love the statement in the report where it actually talks about a system built on compassion. And for me, that's it's kind of say no more. Really, everything else can flow from there. Because if we are truly going to build a system based on compassion, then it's actually making sure that the pillars are there, and trauma being one of them, but that it also supports both consumers, carers and clinicians, because this is about a reform that is equal. It has to actually work for all of us to be able to actually to deliver.
Yeah, and I think that's, you know, one of the big challenges, just speaking a bit more generally, is how do we move our mindset from one where I think the whole system has just been crushed effectively by unmet demand and potentially even unable to articulate what good looks like, and how can you step back and say we're changing the whole foundations upon which we want to build this new system, one that's built on compassion and all of the, you know, trauma-informed care, family-centred care. It's going to require a lot of effort and a lot of stepping back and out of kind of existing cultures that I think will be really challenging. But if we can walk away and through all of the initiatives that we're implementing, kind of stand up and say that we're implementing in the spirit and the intent of the Royal Commission's report, and able to kind of point to where we are delivering against all of the principles that the Royal Commission has set out for us, that'll be really important. But yeah, we can't lose focus of that as we kind of go into the detail of specific deliverables. We also have to stand back and say, is this delivering to all of the principles set out in the Royal Commission's report? And it's just a reflection, again, having come from a year of implementation, when you're delivering, you know, acute beds, expanded acute beds, and hope services in different regions, you can get really, of course, focused on the detail, but you always need to step back and say, to really reflect on how this is delivering to both the spirit and the intent in the Royal Commission's report. It's not just the tick of 35 beds, it's how is everything else reflected through the delivery of this, the design and the delivery.
Megan, are there specific recommendations that, from an implementation point of view or perspective, you're particularly excited about in the shorter term rather than the longer? And I was talking about the 10-year roadmap that we'll all develop or come to understand together, and that's really important to hold that longer range perspective. Are there any that in the short term, though, in the next 2 years, you're excited about?
I have to say I'm not deliberately trying to dodge your question, but I'm really focused on workforce, because to me, if we don't take a really kind of intense, dedicated focus on workforce, we won't be able to deliver on the recommendations. And just my first reading of the report, and I have to say every time I read it, I discover new details. So I feel like I need to keep going back and reading and rereading. But it is so clear that the workforce pipeline that we now need to focus on. So it is a really immediate, in fact, kind of action we need to take if we are to deliver on these initiatives over the longer term. And so how can we, how can we increase workforce supply, but really take a much more strategic view of workforce? And how are we thinking about workforces which don't yet exist? Like, it's one thing to say we can expand junior medical officer psychiatry rotations, or get more scholarships for mental health nurses, but how are we thinking about those workforces that don't actually exist? That's, I think, a really important early focus for us if we're to deliver on kind of all of the recommendations throughout the report, because workforce, even through the interim report recommendations, we have seen some health services struggle with recruitment. And of course, we've got context of the pandemic and rural and regional issues. We no longer have international, overseas qualified people coming in and supporting the system as we might in other circumstances. But this is a real issue, I think, for us to take an early focus on. Totally. But really exciting opportunity as well. How can we envisage new workforces? How can we expand existing workforces, upskill ensure we've got all of the supports in place, in particular for the lived experience workforces who will be taking on new leadership positions. I think it's a really exciting place to be focused on.
Anna, representing and looking out for and supporting the current biggest single workforce, do you have anything you wanted to add, thinking about nurses and their integral roles to these changes?
Yeah, I think it's an exciting time for mental health nursing. I think it's exciting to know that mental health nurses could be working with other workforces. I think the idea that, we want to be nurse-centric, absolutely not. There is a role for mental health nurses, just as there's a role for lived experience advisors, there's a role for, for OT, social workers. Every discipline has its role to play. I think the exciting thing is the breadth of the workforce for the future that we could be working with. And I also think it's exciting actually to maybe for workforces like nursing to start actually stepping into the role more instead of being as generic maybe as we have been in the past, and actually understanding where nursing sits within this the bigger agenda of the changing landscape that we're going to have in Victoria. And I think it's going to be important actually for all disciplines to understand their role and function within a changing landscape. But I think the most exciting thing is going to be working together with others, much more than we have been able to in the past, and to not be in a position, hopefully in the future, of continually just responding to almost seems like emergencies, and actually being able to be therapeutic. When I started my training, using therapies as a way of actually engaging with people, therapeutically engaging with people, was what I was trained to do. And what I'd like to see is nurses getting back to that, getting back to being able to run groups, to be able to engage with people on that much more than that one-to-one level in a way that they can't do at the moment with acuity in our services. Our services the demand is so high that the ability to do that is lost. So I think, the future, I think, is a great one for nurses. And, we're beginning to see that. We're beginning to see a shift in where our nursing workforce is coming from. Some would say that COVID has had a huge impact on the ability to recruit. And yes, it has. And we haven't been able to recruit from overseas. But we have been able to recruit new graduates and new postgraduates. And also, we're actually seeing people wanting to move from other parts of health into mental health. I think there is a positive in COVID, which has actually raised the awareness in society about mental health and well-being. And I actually think that's having a positive outcome and will only increase to have a positive outcome. Again, as we actually start talking about what the new landscape for mental health is going to be in Victoria, I think it's actually it's a win for us. I think it's a win for all disciplines, but I'm certainly seeing it particularly in the nursing space. So I'm very much glass half full rather than half empty, always are. But I do think it's actually it's a exciting and positive time, and I think all workforces will actually will benefit in the short term as well as the long term for the report.
Thinking about what you were saying, Anna, about nurses and other staff not being able to use the full range of the full repertoire of their skills, their interests and their abilities that brought them into this space, but also their skills from their training. I'm just thinking as well about just unhelpful terms like, Jashua was talking about the borderline label doesn't help. I don't know that case management helps either. I was just curious about whether others on the panel want to make any comment about case management as a term, which does seem to be part of the de-skilling, or what we would move towards post-case management, if you will, post people being cases. I don't know.
I certainly can hear my colleagues, lived experience colleagues that I work with in the department, and we often have this discussion about case.
Yeah.
And they always say, well, I'm not a case. I'm a person. And I think if we just keep thinking about what's the consumer's needs that we're working with, what's the family's needs that we're working with, do we need to put a label on it? I don't know. You know, the minute you put a label, someone will like it and someone will hate it. I think it's been consistent with, you know, what Megan's already said about the principles. What are the principles? What are the things that we're actually trying to achieve? What's our vision that we're trying to achieve? And actually remember, people are people, and let's just work in that way and just focus on what people need and how we can actually help them get to that space where they've got what they need. Yeah, that's all I would like to say on that, because I struggle with it as well. I think it's an outdated, outmoded term. Not sure what the alternative is other than just focusing on the person.
Did others on the panel have one of the questions that was posed that they'd like to talk to a little bit today that we haven't had the chance to talk about just yet?
Can you remind us what the question is?
So we had, yeah, absolutely. So we had, what do the final recommendations mean to the mental health and wellbeing of Victorian women? What are the opportunities the recommendations offer women? So from here, future focus. Are there any limitations for women? So in our first readings of the final report, and does this translate to all women, marginalised women, consumers of mental health services who identify as women, LGBTIQ women, and women supporting someone on a mental health recovery journey through the mental health system?
Can I start?
Yeah.
So post-COVID, we still haven't caught up with the mental health needs of women, and particularly, and I again was bashing people's ears before this, it's middle-aged women, and it's not, you know, only young women, although young women of course have their own particular issues, but middle-aged women bore the brunt of a lot of awfulness during COVID, and we're still seeing that middle-aged women have been the bulk of the caring population for the young. So, you know, the mum with the trying to do homeschooling, who's got a sick relative, who's then perhaps out of work because she was in the casual workforce, or is a frontline healthcare worker, because we know that's particularly a female group. All of these impacts, and then if she's got a rocky relationship that might have taken a turn for the worse, perhaps even with violence, this is the sort of person that we're still trying to catch up for in terms of her mental health needs. And I think when we talk about the missing middle, it's a good description because it's middle age, but it's also middle in the sense that this isn't the person who is going to necessarily end up in emergency department and then off to the psych ward in a hospital, nor is it the person whose needs will completely be met by Lifeline or one of the other very community-focused agencies, and right bang smack in the middle, who normally would go off into the private sector. But you've got to have private health insurance to do that, and this is the group that I think are missing out. So I'm looking for, in the recommendations, how this group will actually be able to get. And I think there's some good bits in the recommendation which suggests that some of the hubs, some of the walk-in clinics and so on might be able to cater for this particular group. Another suggestion that I was thinking is, you know, the Americans talk about their private school voucher system. You know, down the track, we might be able to see something like that there is a kind of deal between the private and public sectors where people can, have private experience, even if they don't have complete private health insurance. That's a big box to open. But we may need to think about things outside the box like that down the track. But I'm still more hopeful with the reform suggestions that this middle group are not going to miss out as much as they have in our current system. And I can tell you that the middle group is a big number, and we're still trying to play catch up with what happened with COVID. And I'd like people to talk a bit more about middle-aged women. We're not meant to be invisible, but often in the landscape, the elderly, whose plight is dreadful, do get a bit more notice, and the young get a lot of notice. But let's not forget the people who are kind of the meat in the sandwich, trying to deal with both ends of the age spectrum.
Absolutely. Anna, Megan, do either of you have anything to add, thinking about that group or what the recommendations might mean for that group?
I suppose the move to actually have, it's now going to be infants and children and adults and older adults system. That will help to some degree because the focus will be different for those groups, and quite rightly so. And I would hope that through that process that we would actually start picking up that client group. I think also, the community aspect and the emphasis on community and the emphasis on well-being is actually the other element that I think has been missing from our system. We've always been about illness, and it's now the discussion about well-being. I think is a hook to actually to start engaging with, if you want that missing middle, that middle group, which is a group that is difficult in all aspects of health. It's not just in mental health. It's a group that can be quite difficult to reach out to for varying reasons. But I think the emphasis on community, the emphasis on well-being, and then the split certainly should assist.
I think as well, one of the other areas, it's kind of similar to the outcomes framework that I mentioned earlier, is if we actually have data on what is happening to these women and the sorts of services they're accessing, as the final report does have a real focus on holding government to account and holding all of the partners to account. So let's, if we're actually measuring and capturing data on the experiences of the missing middle, as they've been termed, we need to ensure that we're actually responding to that and holding ourselves to account for responding to that. So I think through the commission that's being established, through the mental health framework, which will be developed in consultation with people with lived experience, as well as clinicians and others, representatives across government, we need to look at the specific indicators we are putting in there that direct our attention to this issue.
Absolutely. So Tandem's certainly excited about the potential of the family carer contributions to the hubs across the state that have been named in the recommendations as well, the 8 centres, because a lot of carers fall into that missing middle as well. Absolutely. Because of the burdens of care in that life stage. Both ends, very much so. So the opportunity to have a voice in the design of those is a very exciting opportunity, and Tandem members are already letting us know that that's an exciting opportunity, whatever that's going to look like in whatever time frame, that their voice being heard, I think, during last year is something that members are already excited about and hopeful, managing to sustain hope about, which is great. And there'll probably be some questions from members too. I don't know whether now's a good time, Beck, to bring in a couple of questions. That would be lovely.
I do. I have one in relation to what you've just discussed, and I have another one as well. So I'll start with one that is on the topic from Rosalie. She said, for discussion, if thought suitable by an older mother, more conversations are needed. So I'm not sure if this is a question I'm reading as I go, but an interesting point. More conversations are needed around mental health in the community to help normalise discussions on mental ill health as part of general ill health. If we want the whole of the community involved, we need to bring them on board. Education in mental health first aid needs to be encouraged in the community. We need to encourage respect for all individuals and value everyone's life, as we are all part of the whole. Treat as we would like to be treated. And there's another comment, absolutely pleased the missing middle was recognised in the Royal Commission. The missing middle is missed throughout the most of life, and this area is full of experience.
Yep.
I'm not sure if anyone would like to comment on that. Or
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing that in our clinic. It's just, I think it was actually the former mental health minister who said COVID just blew the cracks that were in the system up into this big chasm. And this is a group that fell into the chasm because, you know, they're the sort of hidden workforce in terms of just keeping everything ticking over. And all of a sudden they were just hit with all sorts of increased stresses. And we're still seeing the morbidity in terms of anxiety, depression, physical health damage, and alcoholism. So that was the other issue that happened as well. And we've got to fight our way through that. But all of the COVID surveys that were done in this country and internationally showed that women between 35 and 55 really had the worst outcomes in terms of mental health because of these caring extra issues and stresses that were put on.
Just to pick up on stigma, because that's called out in the report, and it's actually called out to do something about, more generally, about stigma within the community, and the introduction of health promotion, you know, chief or lead within the mental health division is a really important one, because we've never had that before. And again, it's about the scope of the report. It's gone beyond what we would normally have thought about as mental health services in the past, and going right out into the community and saying it's everyone's business. So stigma, you know, very much is something which, you know, we'll all be involved in work around how to overcome that.
I think as well, just the focus on mental health and well-being really invites people in, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's that in itself is kind of destigmatizing, because everyone has an interest in their own well-being, mental health and well-being. So hopefully even that narrative kind of supports a really a shift in people's attitudes towards mental ill health as we take a really positive approach to you know, the dialogue that we're having with people.
It's going to need this issue of supporting that age group in those caring roles is going to need some brand new thinking, I think, because one of the things that we were really advocating for at Tandem during last year was the uptake more consistently. There's pockets of it across the state, but the uptake more consistently of existing evidence-based approaches that do support family members, but they largely support family members to be still better informed carers in the aid of their loved one or their close friend. So there's approaches such as family psychoeducation that are excellent and that are not done routinely, but the little bit of research I've done in that space has tended to show that you significantly improve people's understanding of diagnoses, it's a whole other conversation, but of illness, of the system, of navigating supports and so on, but you don't really impact their own well-being through 5 sessions of something. So we don't even routinely have the 5 sessions offered everywhere of information and basic support. We really don't have yet models that will help people with their coping and their wellness. And Tandem's scored quite a bit through the pledge and other work that members have done, and the team here at Tandem have done around what the potential benefits of system navigators and supports would be. So I'm really excited about the potential for more of those roles coming from the recommendations.
And I think the Royal Commission does call out the opportunity to look at some of the really successful kind of demonstration projects and how do we get greater uptake across the system and across regions and different geographic areas of some of what we know is working, rather than us, you know, going through budget cycles and perhaps letting a really successful project just fall by the wayside. So that's going to be really important as we establish the new regional boards and the local mental health and wellbeing area mental health and wellbeing services. I'm still getting my head around.
And I was actually going to say, could somebody explain what the new system is? What's it going to look like? Because it's always going to raise anxieties when we talk about system change. But, you know, at the moment, my reading, and I could have this completely wrong, but I thought there was going to be separate mental health boards, 8 established across Victoria. Now, and I'm sorry to hijack the
No, I
conversation.
do, because I'm still struggling with this.
But
I'm still struggling with it.
does that
I'm
mean
sure
that
members are.
the hospital boards, as they exist at the moment, are now not going in this system, would not be responsible for the area mental health service? Because at the moment, St Vincent's, for example, has a mental health service that's taken care of by the St Vincent's CEO, the St Vincent's board, etc., etc. So, is that not happening? And in that way, what are we now de-mainstreaming a little bit?
I'm curious
I don't know.
about,
I'm
curious
curious
about that too, and whether we've got then even more layers of governance. That are going to
and
be
we're looking at
in place,
Megan
or
as
whether
if she's the person who
Yes.
come on, Megan.
Sorry, I don't have all the answers
Sorry
to
about
this
that.
one, but Anna, you can help me out here as well. But my understanding, and I'm still trying to keep across the detail and digest kind of what this means, but the 8 area mental health and wellbeing kind of regions that are governed, I guess, by the regional board is really the 8 regional boards which will look at planning, commissioning and getting integrated services across the region, the geographic region. They will work with and support the local area mental health services. I'm sure I'm using the wrong terminology here. I think in the detail of the report, the Royal Commission actually says what's the population group that the area, the regional mental health boards are essentially responsible for, and it's in the millions, 1 million and something. And then what's the cohort, the number that the local services are responsible for. So, and then when you get down into the kind of acute and specialised service delivery, my reading is that, of course, health service boards still have their own responsibilities and accountability, but they need to be working as part of that broader system. But I think there is definitely a lot of detail and thinking that needs to be done now in partnership with all of the players who will make up this, expanded service delivery system.
Yeah, and that's what will happen in the interim to set
Yes.
initially set a structure up, but then the detail of how that structure is actually going to function. That's something which will everyone will be part of through that stakeholder engagement, etc.
And I think it will be really complex. And back to your point, I think earlier, Anna, it won't happen overnight. And we've got to make sure that we get those structures right and those interim arrangements right, and have the processes to engage with people to develop out now the design of the system. And we all want it to kind of happen tomorrow, but I think we need to be a little bit patient to work through some of that detail.
I think that issue, I think that issue though about, are we going to have more governance structures around us? In essence, yes, we are, but for good reason, because to change the way in which a state actually delivers mental health and well-being, you actually need a system to be able to hold it to account and to monitor and make sure that, that all the recommendations are actually the fidelity to everything that the Commission is trying to do. The vision that we've all been part of in developing so far comes alive, and with that you actually do need structure around that, and the development of a Commission, Mental Health Improvement Unit, a revision of the Act and reduce psychiatrists, and also the division actually then going down into the boards, etc. I think we do need that, but what the devil in the detail will be to make sure that doesn't stop us from delivering anything, and stop us from ensuring that money gets spent in the way that it should be spent, and services meet the needs of those that they need to meet the needs of. But I think there is a requirement for us to be held account much more because of the massive change that we're actually embarking on.
I think as well with this, I mean, it is some devolved governance out to regional boards. There's a really good opportunity for government and the department in particular to be able to take a much more strategic statewide approach to planning and commissioning, knowing that at the regional level and at the community level, that is being managed by regional boards and the local areas. So standing back and looking at our system as a whole, what does the state government in partnership with the area mental health boards need to do to ensure that we are kind of pulling the right levers and focusing our efforts in the right places to deliver the best mental health care out to all Victorians.
Yeah. Megan, I'm just still trying to picture too, because I know there's been, and I think some members are as well, just trying to get their head around this. I know that there's been some changes in terms of architecture, I'm not sure if that's the right word, within government around where mental health sits and how mental health will operate. I'm just wondering whether Mental Health Reform Victoria is an interim body or whether it will be part of the mechanism of who holds the sticks and the carrots, if you will, for the system change? Or do we not yet know? It might be we don't know yet. But any light you can shed on where the responsibility for the system change will sit would be super helpful for people to know. I think.
Sure. So Mental Health Reform Victoria was set up as an administrative office in the Department of Health and Human Services for 2 years.
Yeah.
We passed our 1-year birthday on, I think it was the 4th of February, and the Royal Commission has recommended that we do now kind of fold the functions of Mental Health Reform Victoria into the department. We are in the middle of a conversation with our colleagues in the department, and what I think is really evident is that, well, our reflection over the last year and particularly over recent months, it was in part becoming increasingly challenging and feeling like almost we're running 2 systems. And I know we were on the phone to Anna every second day to talk through workforce issues and other issues, just issues, have a conversation about how are you managing this? This is what we're thinking. Are we aligned? Is this consistent? So I think it was becoming increasingly evident that, even before we received the final report, that we were having to join forces in a lot of the thinking and the design work that we were doing on interim report recommendations, and also recognising that as we did some of the design thinking about new hope services, for example, a totally new child and youth hope service, that once the reform component and the design component was done, we were handing over the program to the department to run. And so we really needed to be working hand in glove. And so essentially what I'm saying is I think this is where we were always headed. What the Royal Commission has recommended is that this joining of forces is accelerated, and that, within a 6-month time frame, a new division is set up. And I really want to emphasise it's not just about kind of picking up Mental Health Reform Victoria and putting their, the reform focus that they've been delivering through the interim report, kind of fitting that somewhere within an existing structure. We are looking at a new mental health division. We've got a new Deputy Secretary. We have a new Minister. So we've got a totally new kind of, governance and architecture within the department. But yeah, we are moving to very quickly join forces and look at how the reform focus of Mental Health Reform Victoria, workforce is a really obvious one for us to take an early focus on, is working alongside the work in the department, and they've been doing fantastic work for years. So if that answers your question.
Actually, that was really helpful, actually, because I think for a lot of the family members who are time poor, busy, that middle group we were talking about, knowing what should I be reading, who should I be paying attention to, what are they called, how long are they doing that. It's very important. We've really noticed during the implementation of the Carer Gateway that people are needing to understand how things fit together. And the quicker they can get a clearer sense of who's doing what for how long, who do I ask for things, what do I not have to worry about, and that sort of thing really helps people. So thank you.
That's good. And I guess one thing I would just add to that is we do continue to have responsibility for the implementation of the interim report recommendations, and we're very clear that we cannot take our foot off the pedal in terms of delivering. We are really conscious that we've got to understand what the final report means for our implementation pathway that we've mapped out with consumers, carers, with health services. But we need to continue to deliver on those recommendations, because as the Royal Commission said when they handed down their interim report, they were doing so because they just couldn't wait. There was real urgency to start delivering on some of these workforce initiatives, acute bed expansion, and really pleasingly we can say that we have actually started to deliver more beds and more hope services. So we're keeping our focus on that delivery, but at the same time looking at how is this now working, along the broader, I guess, kind of remit and focus of the final report and its recommendations, and really having regard to that as we continue to deliver.
And there's one chief, a chief wellbeing and mental health.
Yes.
Of a chief of
Yes.
that. That's a single point of accountability for the whole lot at the end. And that person obviously must report to the minister, I presume, or the head of the department.
To the secretary of the department, I think, is called out. Yes.
So that's interesting, because then there isn't a chief psychiatrist and a chief nurse and other, if there are other.
Not within the division. So the chief mental health nurse, because it's in the report, my position will actually go to the Mental Health Improvement Unit in Safer Care Victoria. And within the Mental Health Improvement Unit in Safer Care Victoria, there will be a multidisciplinary team. So I would predict there would be allied health, there will be lived experience advisors, as well as project officers to deliver on the recommendations which are around the continuous work around improvement, work around elimination of restrictive practices, gender safety. There's a whole list of other remits of that unit, and that unit will be an offshoot or part of Safer Care Victoria, but with a focus on mental health improvement. And it just goes slightly beyond what Safer Care Victoria have normally done, because it will also be about looking at practice change and cultural change that needs to happen with another change in a mental health act as well.
That's really helpful for members to get to. Thank you, Anna.
Yeah, that's good.
Beck, did you have any other question?
I do, yes. I have a question from Di and a comment. She said, thank you for the perspectives on women's gender and sexual safety from the beginning of the discussion, perspective models of change and outcome frameworks. At Tandem, we've received calls, so Di works at Tandem. At Tandem, we've received calls from families in rural areas where children's/youth beds are in with adult wards. Consequently, their safety has been extremely compromised. How will, or is there any insight in the report about how psychiatric beds for children and young people will be provided for and managed, particularly the potential to transition across regions if beds are available in one region but not another?
It does call out about the infant and children sector, so actually making a clear distinction about age ranges, about what we cover. Also, again, that availability of beds and going outside of what has been a remit of, you're within this area, so that's where you access. Actually, that is being now, the doors being thrown open really in relation to that. So there are going to be changes in relation to that, and particularly looking at the rural regional centres, because it's not helpful for anyone, and you know, I think the chief psychiatrist takes calls on many occasions during the day around access to services and access for children in rural and regional areas who are in adult beds. So it's been called out. It's been called out to open the doors to the way in which we actually think about our system. So I think there are going to be major changes in that area that will be worked through again with the boards, with how we actually think about that governance structure as well.
I think there is a real focus on some of the issues, access issues in rural and regional communities in the final report, as Anna said, and definitely I think a strong understanding that services to those areas need to be prioritised, and some specific, again, it's a kind of a pipeline, a longer term issue, but real focus on how we can get additional workforce to the regions to be able to open more beds, offer services like hospital in the home, which we're currently doing through Barwon and Origin, following the interim report recommendations. So how can we kind of expand those services with additional workforce across regions?
And the workforce side of it is, again, one of the big keys for the safety issue, because I think this question is about how do you keep your 18-year-old who's distressed and disturbed and in hospital safe from a 35-year-old who might be in close geographical proximity. And that's unfortunately happening at the moment in some of our structures, that we know that the adolescent unit is bang smack right next to and with very little wall between the adult units. So I guess that's another workforce upskilling and having more workforce. Because this is one of the things that we found when the Mental Health Complaints Commissioner asked us to do that work, was exactly that there were too many dark corners and nooks and crannies where there was no staff available to actually sort of be able to be there to make sure everybody was safe. So again, it goes back to what you were saying, Megan, that the additional workforce and training for these safety issues is going to be critical.
Yeah.
Any other observations or questions as well?
I do have another question from Jan Holt. She's asked, how will the recommendations and plans help a family carer who is coping with vicarious trauma and their own mental illness? And are there plans for whole family treatment?
That's a good question. Anything in the report that directly would address that or point to that as a little bit down the line but coming opportunity?
I thought there was more an attempt to actually have a greater number of clinical psychologists engaged in the system, and by that and it's not that's their particular expertise is in delivering therapy, particularly psychotherapy, to a group, as in family group or in individuals as well. And I thought that that was part of what was intended by having that. And I think also the skilling up of other groups in providing that sort of therapy would be really critical. I read with interest that the Mental Health Act, of course, is going to be changed, because one of my bugbears is, I'm going to be passionate here, is the ludicrous situation we have where you have to maintain confidentiality with the individual, but then you're asking the parents, say, to be the managers of the whole person's well-being at home. And yet they've been out in the corridor while all this discussion's been going on. That's just ridiculous. And so, we do have provision under the current Mental Health Act if you need to actually break some of that confidentiality, but it doesn't always happen. So I think anything that we can do that identifies very early on who is here as your group that you're managing, and it's never just one person, who's the group, therefore everybody's in on the therapy, or everybody's in on the management plan and the treatment plan, which has got much more success then of being enacted, no matter where you are, whether you're in an inpatient unit, in a tent, in a field somewhere, or whatever. And again, by skilled workforce. I think that's a really good, powerful combination.
It's been striking with the Mental Health Act that we have at the moment that there's provisions for that haven't
but
really been
people
taken
haven't
up.
used it.
They haven't.
No.
And even when we've had really good education campaigns to support staff led by peer workers, in fact, alongside clinicians working together, I've seen it delivered in quite a few area mental health services where it's been explicitly delivered by a senior clinician and a peer worker, and it's been pretty user-friendly how to enact it actually. And yet the uptake, they've been really disappointed. Those staff have been really disappointed that they've done all this training and then it hasn't been used. So how we can think about supporting workforce to use some of the provisions, however they are in the new Act, is going to be really important, I think.
And I think that, again, that does get called out about how we actually take the workforce through a cultural shift. Because this is a cultural shift. And it's about, yes, we'll change the Mental Health Act, the Mental Health and Wellbeing Act, and that in itself is such a huge shift in thinking. But it does get called out that we actually need to do some specific work around taking the workforce through that change, which, to be honest, we really didn't do as well as we should have, could have, for the 2014 Act. And there was lots of reasons, probably why that happened in the way in which it happened. But we didn't make that shift culturally with the 2014 Act. So now it's been called out that we actually need to do very, very specific work to make sure that that does happen. And that the cultural change that needs to come with this reform actually happens. Because you can change structures and you can change buildings, but unless you change the culture and you actually drive that through the way in which people do their practice, then it's pointless. And that's what's being called out, that we need to do that work specifically.
I think as well, just adding to that, it is very much about cultural change, but it's also recognising that this is a really complex system and it's very dynamic, the relationships between all the different parts. And as as one actor, I think as the Royal Commission says, as one actor kind of moves in one direction, it influences what's happening around them. And so for me, and again, reflecting on the year that we've had in Mental Health Reform Victoria, it's really hard at this point in time, or as it was when we were given the interim report recommendations, to be able to speak to the detail of how this is going to work. But what is really important is that ongoing dialogue and ensuring that in the detailed design and delivery of programs, we are engaging with people with lived experience, consumers, carers, supporters. We are, many of whom, of course, are women and who are bringing that gendered lens to the work that they do. And for what it's worth, I would say that from implementation of interim report recommendations, carers, consumers, supporters have been hugely influential in the shaping of programs of recommendations we are trying to deliver. And that's, they've been influential because we've employed a consumer and a carer senior advisor. I know that Anna has in her office consumers and carers. We've set up a forum with Tandem and VIMIAC. When we're engaging with health service, we have set an expectation that their consumer and carer representatives will be at our meetings and invited to speak. And I think it's just the start of kind of a culture change and really saying this is now our expectation. And I do want to share with all of your members that, both Tandem and VIMIAC members have been really influential, and the thinking and the perspectives that they have brought to interim report recommendations has really helped shape our programs, and I should call them programs, but the services that we are now looking to implement. And we've seen, as a result of inviting people into these conversations and co-designing programs, that we then have health services calling Tandem and Vimiac saying, we now need you to come and help us because, you know, we can't do this without you. And that's a really positive change. And I think the more that we can ensure this dialogue continues, you know, we don't have the detail yet, and neither should we in some cases, because it's a discovery and design process in part. But we just need to make sure the right people are around the table to inform that design and that thinking.
Do we have maybe just one or two final observations or questions, and then we'll have panel members maybe make a final point if they have.
Jan had said, as you were speaking, you asked that question, said she's cheering for these responses, and a few people agreed, so I wanted to share that with you. And there was another comment on the topic, which was, I think, important to note, which is that there more work needs to be done on recognising intergenerational transmission of trauma, vicarious trauma as a society, and the impact on children, parents, grandparents, brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, friends. And as a grey care consultant once said to me, it is a ripple cumulative effect across communities, which I think is a very good point. There was another question that was asked, or a comment that was made, and I think this has come up from a lot of people that call us through our care support line. And there's an issue around making a complaint to the Mental Health Complaints Commissioner. So frequently the patient is not well enough to make a complaint, but a complaint really needs to be made and family and friends can't do it. And even though there is sometimes provision to do that, it's not being done. And I wonder if anyone had any comments on that.
I think it's, there was a design flaw, if you want, in the development of the complaints process, and I know that that's been picked up. You know, the chief psychiatrist's office often get calls actually from carers by default, but we do work very closely with the Complaints Commission around trying to navigate our way around that design flaw, if you want. I think what's called out though in the final report is actually that change in the role and function of the Mental Health Complaints Commissioner, and the fact that it will be part of the Commission, and being part of the Commission and a Commission that will be made up of lived experience commissioners is a significant shift in the way in which we're our oversight and governance of the system. So I'm hoping that will pick up those issues. Again, it's going to take a bit of time for that to be actioned, but you know, I think it's absolutely the right way to go to make sure that we actually do pick those issues up, because otherwise they do fall between the cracks.
Jess, who made the previous comment about recognising intergenerational transmission of trauma, just wanted to comment that she's also a young carer herself. So just wanted to let you know.
Can I just add a bit there? I've been working recently with women, Indigenous women, and my goodness, if we want to learn about intergenerational trauma, we just need to learn from this particularly horribly traumatised group, you know, for centuries. And there's a lot of really good techniques that they have, which we're trying to put into a therapy, which is about telling the stories, and a very strong female culture. This thing called Drinking the Mother, which is about actually the elder women providing safe, nurturing compassion for the younger women. And it's a really powerful tool for trauma therapy. So I just don't know why we haven't done that so overtly for so long. You know, they're hard-won, bitter experience, but boy, have they got a lot to teach us.
Opportunity to share that more broadly through the healing centres, which have been called out in the final report recommendations as well.
Yes, those are that powerful grandmother, mother, daughter, and it can be in men as well, but this is particularly about sexual abuse.
Do panel members have any last comments or insights or observations to share with Tandem members today. It's been wonderful spending time with you all. Really appreciate it.
I think the only thing I'd probably say is it's such a momentous moment in time, and I think we should just all just take that in about what our future is going to be like. But with that, comes the hard work that we're all going to have to put into that, and actually compassion to each other through that process, because it will be difficult and it will be challenging, and we will challenge each other, I'm sure, through this process. We already have, just in the Commission getting to its final report, but I think we are just going to have to continually show that compassion to each other, because it's a long journey ahead of us to make huge change, not only to the mental health system, but actually in many respects to the society in Victoria.
Yeah. Any other?
Well, I'm probably the oldest person here, so I lived through.
I don't know about that.
I just making my notes. I lived through deinstitutionalisation phase 1, when the big asylums got done, and all the people were decanted to various hospitals. And in that very first round, way back, I was the director at Dandenong, and that was 1993, 94, 93. So, we were all very enthusiastic. And the first round of it, there was good resourcing of the community team. So we could actually go to people's homes and actually engage with carers and family. You see people, you would have, a cup of tea in someone's home. That gives you a hugely different perspective. You wait to be asked to sit down. You don't go in there and just take over and so on. And the sorts of work that was done then was, I thought, particularly useful. Unfortunately, the next years saw a depletion of the resourcing. So it wasn't so much the deinstitutionalisation, it was the depletion of resources. And that's when things started to fall apart big time, that there wasn't enough. There wasn't enough money, there weren't enough skilled workforce, there weren't enough backup beds, and then the poor carers just got thrust into this kind of, you'll do this. That was terrible. And I think we're still copying the brunt of all of that. So Anna's glass half full, I'm glass half waiting, I think, at this point. Because if we go back to deinstitutionalisation level 1 with good resourcing, it'll work, and we'll have a lot more satisfied customers and a lot better quality of life for people who really have struggled, both carers, consumers as well. If we go into some kind of cost-cutting, money-saving issues, then I fear we might sort of be halfway between two horses, and that's not a pleasant situation. So that's why I'm half glass waiting. Yep. But I definitely think that the context of the report and the stuff in the report is absolutely superb. So, and I'm wearing Women's Health Victoria hat today, although I've got many hats, and Women's Health Victoria would like a bit more focus on women in the actual recommendations, although they're not, it's not excluded, but just to use the word a bit more frequently and actually deliver some of those changes, because very, very much the missing middle are very much female dominant, and there's many other issues that women are struggling with in the mental health sector that we need help with. So that's my take on it. I'm sorry if I'm sitting on the fence, but I just want to see where we'll be in terms of resourcing.
I'm going to bring it back to glass half full, which I'm a very glass half full sort of person. I think you're absolutely right, Jayashri. We really need to guard against this being kind of a really intense early focus and then having depleted resources. But I think with some of the really significant enablers and governance measures which are being put in place, we will have enshrined in legislation in the new Mental Health and Wellbeing Act kind of the vision for what it is we are looking to deliver. We will have an outcomes framework which will hold us to account. We'll have the new commission, we'll have we'll have a statutory position, a chief mental health and wellbeing officer in the department. So I think there is a lot there that will ensure we can maintain what is this really, it's almost like a perfect storm, isn't it, of focus in a really positive way on mental health and wellbeing, a focus which I think is shared by the Commonwealth government, state government, community following the pandemic. And if we can enshrine, I guess, through some of the governance, the legislation, some of the really critical positions to ensure this focus is maintained, then we will be in a very good place when we look back in 4 or 5 years and 10 years' time, and hopefully be able to say, yes, we delivered as we intended to, and as the Royal Commission basically stepped out for us.
I'd like you all at home and wherever you're joining us from to join me in thanking our panel members, and we'd like to also thank you for your participation and your engagement with us today. It's been quite an unusual and special opportunity for us to be physically in a space together, we were commenting on just beforehand. In fact, we thought about doing this panel remotely, and all of us were quite eager to be physically in a space together. And so to members as well, I want to just remind you that we at Tandem are also really looking forward to, in a couple of weeks, the opportunity to be physically with a number of you at the Zoo event that is coming up, and again online with some of you on that date as well, where we celebrate the hard work and amazing contributions of workers across this state when we give out the awards that have been delayed from last year, because there's just been so much hard work during last year that I know family members have really appreciated from the workforce. And so that will be a special opportunity where I look forward to seeing you all again soon. But for today, please join me in thanking Jayashri Kulkarni, Anna Love and Megan Phelan for such an interesting, stimulating and helpful, while we make sense of this, digest this discussion around the final report and the recommendations. So virtual clapping ensues, and just thank you all again. I really appreciate it very much.
Thanks for
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. We'll say goodbye. We will just give a little gesture of thanks on your behalf.
Oh, how beautiful. Thank you. What a fabulous gift.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
And I've got to keep it alive.
Thank you. That's lovely.
That's
Thank you very
lovely.
much.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.